For 60 years, the Maxwell family kept silent about the derelict mansion on Hollowbrook Road. They said the place was an embarrassment. They said the inheritance was a curse. But when Robert Maxwell finally opened the sealed metal box hidden beneath the cellar floor, he didn't find old money. He found a telegram dated November 1941. The message warned his great-grandfather that the government was watching and that association with his guests was now considered suspicious. What terrifying secret did Arthur Maxwell Sr. bury to protect not his reputation, but the lives of those fleeing the greatest evil of the age? The entire truth and Robert's fate was hidden in that box. If this powerful story of courage and consequence touches your heart, please support us by subscribing to our channel. The air in the grand drawing room of the Maxwell estate in Wellesley outside Boston was heavy with the rich scent of balsam, fir, roasting goose, and the expensive brandy being passed around. It was Christmas evening, December 25, 2020, and the annual Maxwell family reunion was in full, if slightly strained effect. 30-odd people, a dazzling collection of cousins, aunts, and in-laws filled the space, their laughter and chatter echoing off the high sculpted ceiling. Rob Maxwell stood against the periphery, a quiet sentinel near the tall arched window overlooking the freezing suburban grounds. At 56, the holiday warmth felt like a distant phenomenon, unable to penetrate the quiet shell he inhabited. He held a glass of ginger ale, its fizz long gone, its sweetness now, just flat syrup mirroring the forced conviviality of the evening. The house owned by his uncle George Maxwell was a monument to old money and impeccable taste, a world Rob felt increasingly alienated from. His own life had been quietly upended a year prior when the divorce from his wife Patricia was finalized. The legal separation had been quiet, but the subsequent emotional separation from his children had been loud in its silence. His daughter Julia, 31, worked in marketing in the city. She was positioned by the enormous fireplace, radiating competence and self-sufficiency, as she discussed the latest tech IPOs with two cousins. She cast a single distracted glance in Rob's direction, a polite cursory acknowledgement that felt less like recognition and more like checking a box. His son, Ethan, 28, who lived in California, was absent, having sent a short text to the family thread with a generic holiday photo. The regular phone calls from his children had become infrequent, then non-existent. Rob often found himself staring at the phone, wondering if the distance was a natural consequence of adulthood or a definitive statement on his own failures as a father and husband. Tonight, surrounded by the clamor of his kinship, Rob felt the chilling realization that he was deeply and fundamentally alone. Just after 7 o'clock, as the carols subsided and before the dessert was served, the room was startled into silence. The heavy front door opened, and standing there outlined against the cold night was Mr. Phillipson, the longtime family attorney. The sight of the lawyer dressed in his customary dark, austere suit was instantly jarring. Uncle George, whose hand froze mid-gesture as he toasted the season, frowned, his jovial mask slipping into suspicion. "Phillipson, for heaven's sake!" George snapped, his voice carrying clearly. "It's Christmas Day. Surely this could have waited until the new year, mister." Phillipson stepped into the hall, shaking off a few flakes of late snow. "My deepest apologies for the disturbance, George. Believe me, I wouldn't interrupt the holiday, save for the explicit and non-negotiable instruction of the late Arthur Maxwell Sr. Arthur Maxwell Sr. Rob's great-grandfather had passed away peacefully 2 weeks prior at his assisted living facility. Rob had attended the funeral sitting near the back, observing the grief of relatives he barely knew. Mr. Maxwell was quite clear. Mr. Phillipson continued opening his worn leather briefcase. His final will stipulated that the reading of his primary bequest concerning the Hollowbrook estate was to occur at the first major family gathering where all principal members were present. He wanted, and I quote, to resolve all outstanding affairs before the commencement of a new year, unquote. The tense anticipation in the room was palpable. Everyone knew the legend of the Hollowbrook estate, 43 acres of prime undeveloped land in a highly desirable area anchored by an enormous decaying mansion. It was viewed as the family's greatest untapped asset, long protected by Arthur Sr.'s stubborn refusal to sell. George and his faction had expected to carve it up. "Proceed, Phillipson," George hissed, waving toward the chairs. "But quickly, this is highly disrespectful." The family settled, their forced smiles gone, replaced by expressions of thinly veiled avarice and impatience. Rob remained by the wall, detached, expecting the usual distribution of small cash gifts. Mr. Phillipson read through the minor legacies in a dry, monotonous voice, distributing antique watches and small sums of cash to various cousins. Each announcement met with muted reactions. Then Mr. Phillipson paused, adjusting his position and his tone. His voice, when it resumed, was heavier, commanding the full attention of the room. "Now, regarding the substantial residual estate, specifically the property located at 1247 Hollowbrook Road, I read the exact text of Arthur Maxwell Sr.'s final and specific wishes." He paused, his eyes finding Rob's, holding them for an uncomfortable second. "To my great-grandson, Robert Maxwell, I leave the entirety of my estate located at 1247 Hollowbrook Road, including the main house, all outbuildings, and the surrounding 43 acres, along with all contents contained therein." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that swallows sound and breath. Rob blinked, certain he must have misheard, or that the lawyer had mistakenly read the wrong name. It was Uncle George who broke the spell. He slammed his hand onto the arm of his chair, launching himself to his feet, his face an alarming shade of deep crimson. "This is an outrage," George bellowed, his voice raw with fury. "It's a travesty. 43 acres of prime real estate. To him, Phillipson, you know, Arthur suffered from severe memory lapses. Rob manipulated him. I tell you, he hasn't even been near Arthur for years." Mr. Phillipson remained rigidly professional. Arthur Maxwell Sr. was repeatedly assessed by independent medical professionals and declared to be of sound mind when he signed this codicil. The document is absolutely legally binding, George. The estate in its entirety passes to Robert Maxwell. Linda, Rob's cousin, jumped in, her voice shrill with indignation. "Why, Robert? Why the one who walked away from his own marriage and career? He doesn't belong. He'll run the property into the ground. This is a disgrace to the Maxwell name." A floodgate of accusations opened. Rob, still rooted to his spot, felt the focused, intense beam of collective rage. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. "I didn't ask for this," he finally managed quietly. "I had no idea." "Exactly," George roared, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Rob. "You barely knew the old man. This property was meant for those of us who carry the torch, who maintain the family reputation, not for some failure who only shows up to the holiday buffet." Even Julia turned away from the crowd, her expression a mix of shame and anger directed solely at her father. "Dad, what were you thinking? Why would you allow this fight? Why now?" The room became a maelstrom of recrimination and conspiracy theories. Rob was no longer the lonely observer. He was the perpetrator of the worst kind of holiday betrayal. He was trapped, the scapegoat of his great-grandfather's calculated act. Mr. Phillipson quickly placed a heavy brass key and the deed envelope onto a side table, making a hasty retreat out the front door. The family followed, not in mourning, but in bitter, outraged rejection. They grabbed their coats and stormed out, their angry farewells reserved solely for George. They refused to make eye contact with Rob. George was the last to leave the room, his voice low and menacing as he delivered his threat. This is far from over, Robert. We will find a legal way to overturn this. You will regret inheriting that burden." And then George, too, was gone. Rob stood utterly alone in the silent, glittering wreckage of the Christmas celebration. The fire hissed faintly, and the smell of expensive food turned stale. The only objects left in his sphere were the heavy brass key and the manila envelope, resting like cold damning evidence on the mahogany table. He had wanted peace, a moment of connection. Instead, on December 25th, 2020, he had inherited a profound conflict and the deep, abiding hatred of his entire family. Robert Maxwell had a mansion 43 acres and a mystery to solve, but he had no one left to share it with. The drive took Rob Maxwell far from the manicured lawns of Wellesley, through the increasingly rural edges of the county, until the GPS finally guided him down an unmarked, overgrown gravel track. The journey had lasted 3 hours, and with every mile, the resentment he felt toward his inheritance and his family had settled into a dull, determined curiosity. It was late January 2021, a little over a month since the catastrophic Christmas reading of the will. The track, barely visible beneath a carpet of decaying oak leaves, wound through dense woodland. Towering maples and oaks skeletal against the gray sky pressed in on the old road. Then the trees abruptly gave way, and Rob saw it. The Hollowbrook estate was a ruinous vision of a bygone era. It stood like a ghost against the backdrop of the winter woods, a massive 3-story Gothic revival mansion built of mottled gray stone. Steep gables and pointed arches gave it a dramatic, haunting appearance. Climbing ivy thick as cables clawed its way across the facade, obscuring cracked and broken windows. The roof sagged visibly in several places. It was not a house. It was a testament to decades of willful, complete neglect. Rob pulled his old truck up onto what had once been a circular drive, now a tangle of weeds and hardened mud. The silence was profound, broken only by the sharp, cold wind moving through the dry branches. He felt no sense of ownership, only the heavy, oppressive weight of a monumental burden. He saw his own life reflected in its neglect, once grand, now falling apart and utterly alone in a wilderness. Climbing the front steps, Rob tested each one before trusting his weight. The oak front door, heavy and intricately carved, was softened by decay. The brass key Mr. Phillipson had given him was cold in his hand. It turned with a reluctant, rusty screech in the ancient lock. The door groaned inward, releasing a blast of frigid, musty air that smelled of dust mildew and time itself. Rob stepped into the entry hall, a space that should have been magnificent, but was now simply heartbreaking. A grand staircase swept upward into the gloom. Stained sheets draped over forms of furniture, like pale, accusing ghosts, and wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, sorrowful strips. He spent the first hour simply walking through the main floor, the cavernous parlor, the ruined dining room, the kitchen with its monstrous cast-iron stove and ancient icebox. Everything was covered in a thick, insulating layer of dust and decay. There was no electricity, no running water, and a cold that seemed to originate from the stone itself. Rob made his way carefully upstairs. The second floor was a dark labyrinth of bedrooms, mostly empty, save for ruined mattresses and cracked dressers. He moved toward the back of the house where the air felt subtly different, a little less damp, a little more personal. He found the study at the end of the hall. Unlike the other rooms, this one had been intentionally preserved, almost sealed. A large, leather-topped desk sat facing the window, coated in dust, but otherwise clear. Built-in bookshelves covered 2 walls, still lined with volumes, history, philosophy, and books in languages Rob couldn't identify. He walked toward the shelves, trailing his finger through the thick dust. Rob had never truly known his great-grandfather Arthur. The man he remembered from childhood visits was stern, formal, and always retreating into this very room, dealing with papers and quiet, serious matters. Rob had always been intimidated by the place. He reached for a thick leather-bound volume on ancient history. As his hand brushed the spine, he felt a slight give, a subtle difference in the texture of the shelf. He ran his hand along the surface again, pressing lightly. A small section of the wood about 2 feet wide clicked softly and pushed inward. Rob froze, his heart pounding a sudden, rapid rhythm. He pushed again, more deliberately. The panel swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a compartment carved directly into the wall. He pulled the panel fully open, shining his truck flashlight inside. The compartment was deep and filled with bundles of documents tied with brittle yellowed string. This was it. The reason. The thing his family was willing to destroy him for. Rob carefully lifted the top bundle out, carrying it to the desk. He set the heavy papers down and gently picked apart the crumbling string. The papers were letters, dozens of them written on various types of stationery. They were organized, chronologically dated between 1931 and 1937. Rob picked up the top letter and began to read the fine, sloping handwriting, instantly drawing him into the past. Dear Mr. Maxwell. The letter began. I cannot adequately express my gratitude for the sanctuary you have provided. When I arrived at your estate 3 months ago, I was penniless and without hope. The gallery had closed. My paintings were worthless in the economy. You took me in without question, gave me a room, meals, and most importantly, the space and time to continue my work. I am departing now with a commission secured in Philadelphia, but I will never forget what you did for me during the darkest period of my life. With deepest thanks, F.K. Rob read the letter again. Sanctuary. He pulled out another slightly newer document. Mr. Maxwell, my family and I stayed in your home for 6 weeks while I recovered from the injury that cost me my job at the factory. You asked for nothing in return. You fed my children when I could not. We are leaving now for my brother's farm in Iowa, but we will remember your kindness forever. J.R. Wade. A grateful note from a playwright who had found the peace to write his first successful script during a long winter stay in the mansion's east wing. Letter after letter told similar stories, artists, writers, families who had lost everything in the crippling years of the Great Depression. They were thanking Arthur Maxwell Sr. for providing shelter, food, and security during a time when the world had turned its back on them. The initial letters confirmed the first phase of the secret. Great-grandfather Arthur ran a quiet, private relief operation. Rob sat down heavily in the old faded leather chair behind the desk, a faint cloud of dust rising around him. This man, the stern, distant figure of his childhood memory, had been secretly compassionate. He had been quietly giving refuge to desperate Americans when the country was broken. He reached into the compartment for another bundle of papers, but his hand brushed against something small and hard tucked into the far corner. He pulled it out. It was a photograph, a small black and white print slightly faded. It showed a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, laughing, his knees stained with grass, holding up a crooked bouquet of dandelions. The background was clearly the overgrown lawn he had just walked across. Rob stared at the image. It was him. A photograph he didn't even know existed. He flipped the photo over. The handwriting on the back was fine and precise, Arthur Maxwell Sr.'s handwriting. My son did not understand, but I hope one day my great-grandson will. The weight of the decades, the history, and the anger of his living relatives suddenly focused into a single aching realization. His inheritance wasn't a cruel joke or a burden of debt. It was a message. Arthur Sr. had not chosen Rob arbitrarily. He had observed him, kept a private memory of him, and left him a quest that only someone who felt profoundly disconnected could possibly complete. The house no longer felt like a place of ruin, but a place of deliberate preservation, holding its breath for the moment Rob would find the key. The obligation had vanished, replaced by a personal burning quest to understand the man who decades ago had seen something in him that his own family and perhaps even he himself had forgotten. Rob gently placed his childhood photograph on the desk next to the letters confirming the existence of the sanctuary. He had been given more than an estate. He had been given purpose, and he knew with chilling certainty that this was only the beginning of the secrets great-grandfather Arthur had buried. Rob spent the rest of the day in the study carefully photographing the letters from the secret compartment with his phone, creating a digital record of the past. The cold was a constant, sharp presence, but the thrill of discovery generated a warmth that kept him moving. He was no longer just an estranged man wandering through a condemned house. He was an archaeologist of his own family's forgotten heart. He knew there had to be more. The letters spoke of an operation. Operations require records. The next morning, January 29th, 2021, Rob focused his search on the master bedroom upstairs. It was a massive room dominated by a 4-poster bed frame, stripped bare of canopy fabric, its mattress springs sagging like a hammock. Dust lay inches deep, and the windows, though intact, were opaque with decades of grime. He started systematically with the furniture. The wardrobe near the window held nothing but moldering, moth-eaten linens. Rob moved to the large mahogany dresser against the opposite wall. Most drawers were empty, smelling faintly of cedar and decay. The bottom right drawer, however, stuck fast. Rob yanked harder, and it surrendered with a loud grating screech of dry wood on wood. Inside it was lined with brittle yellowed newspapers dating back to the late 1940s. He carefully lifted them out. Beneath the newspapers, the drawer bottom felt oddly thick. Rob ran his fingers along the edges and found a subtle seam. He pressed down on one end, and the opposite end popped up a precisely cut false wooden panel. His pulse quickened. He lifted the panel out and peered into the shallow cavity beneath. Lying there was a leather-bound book, slightly smaller than a traditional ledger, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. He lifted it out reverently. The leather was of superb quality, the kind made to last. The first page, written in the same neat, precise hand as the letters, was labeled Guest Registry, 1931 to 1942. Rob carried the ledger to the window, scraping away a patch of grime to let in the weak winter light. He opened the book and began to read. Page after page, the ledger revealed the systematic organization of the sanctuary. Columns detailed name, date of arrival, date of departure, occupation, and notes. The first entry, dated October 12, 1931, confirmed the operation began precisely with the deepening of the Great Depression. Harold Finch, painter. Departed December 3, 1931. Needed studio space and materials. Completed series of 6 landscapes. The next entry, Margaret Foster and 3 children. Arrived October 20th, 1931. Departed November 15th, 1931. Husband killed in factory accident. Arranged position as housekeeper in Boston. Rob flipped through the pages, his amazement growing. This was not random charity. This was organized, sustained work. The occupations varied widely. Composers, poets, union organizers, professors, factory workers who had been blacklisted, farmers who had lost their land. The dates ran continuously, spanning the entire worst decade of the American economic crisis. The notes beside each name were miniature, poignant narratives of hardship and hope, fled political persecution in home country, completed symphony in East Bedroom, secured position with orchestra in New York, or family evicted, children tutored by other guests, father found work in Chicago. Arthur Maxwell Sr. was running a full-scale private relief and support center, all while the outside world was collapsing. Rob sat on the edge of the abandoned bed, the massive quiet house, holding its decades-long breath around him. He pulled out his phone and searched a few names from the registry. He found a brief biography of Harold Finch, who became a respected landscape painter in the 1940s. his early career noted only vaguely as finding his artistic voice during the Depression. He found an obituary for Dorothy Ashworth, who became a notable author of social justice novels, her first published in 1935, written Rob now knew right here in Hollowbrook. This was real consequential history, a brave private resistance against the overwhelming tides of the time. And his family, George, and the rest had buried it all. After carefully photographing every page of the registry, Rob returned to the study, searching the desk more meticulously. He quickly found what had eluded him before a tiny, almost invisible keyhole built into the decorative carving of the lower right-hand side of the desk. He fumbled with the ring of keys Mr. Phillipson had given him. The third key, a small, intricate one, turned with a solid, reluctant click. Inside the locked drawer lay another leather-bound book. This one was smaller than the ledger, more personal, Arthur Maxwell Sr.'s journal. Rob opened it to the first page, dated January 1st, 1933. I begin this journal as a record of what I believe is necessary work. The world outside these walls grows darker each day. I cannot simply observe the suffering without acting. My resources are not inexhaustible, but I cannot look away from those who have nothing. The entries provided a stark, unfiltered view of the operation's inner life, organizing meals, needing expensive repairs, running low on coal, celebrating small triumphs when a composer finished his work or a family secured a new job. Then came the entry that spoke directly to Rob's own predicament. June 8, 1933. My son visited today. He disapproves of what I am doing here. He called it harboring radicals and wasting the family fortune. We argued. He left angry. I suspect he will not return soon. This grieves me, but I cannot stop what I know to be right, simply to appease those who refuse to see the suffering around them. Rob paused, his breath catching. This was the source of the rot. The son Arthur wrote about was Rob's grandfather. He'd been a young man then, probably in his 20s, obsessed with the respectability of the burgeoning Maxwell business. He had carried that disapproval, that fear of the taint of radicalism for his entire life. It was he who had driven the wedge between the generations, keeping Rob's father and Rob himself distant from this place, distant from Arthur's true character. Rob's throat tightened as he continued reading. August 22nd, 1933. The work grows more difficult. Food costs have risen. But how can I turn away those who come seeking help? Each person who arrives does so because they have nowhere else to go. I am not a wealthy man trying to buy virtue. I am simply someone who has resources and cannot ignore those who lack them. And later, March 15th, 1935. I've been thinking about legacy. Money passes to heirs who may or may not use it wisely. Property decays, but the lives we touch, the small differences we make, perhaps those ripple outward in ways we cannot measure. The young woman who stayed here last year wrote to say she has published her first story. The composer, whose symphony I heard in draft, has secured a position with an orchestra. These are the things that last. Arthur had known his work might be viewed as dangerous or shameful by his own family. He had accepted the price isolation. Rob leaned back in Arthur's old leather chair. He thought of Uncle George's rage at the will, reading the fury that Rob was destroying the family reputation. That fury was 80 years old, passed down through a generation consumed by appearances. They hadn't inherited the sanctuary. They had inherited the fear of the sanctuary. Rob had also known profound isolation since his divorce, the hollow feeling of being unmoored, the slow dissolution of connections. But Arthur had chosen his isolation for a higher principle. Arthur had done what was right, sacrificing comfort and familial acceptance. Rob looked down at the ledger in the journal. He saw Arthur's principled path and the resulting generational burden placed upon him. Arthur had chosen his path. Now Rob had to choose his. He had the opportunity to choose Arthur's path, to champion a forgotten moral truth, no matter the personal cost. He thought of the cold key, the distant mansion, the hatred of his family, and the quiet truth contained in the papers before him. Rob Maxwell had lived his life trying to keep the peace. Now he would fight to uphold this legacy. He would not allow the fear of his living relatives to silence the courage of the man who saw him when no one else did. Rob felt a surge of resolve. He would defend Arthur's work. Rob spent the next 2 days in the mansion study, painstakingly cataloging the contents of the guest registry and journal. He built a small fire in the massive parlor fireplace, the only functional one, just to take the edge off the deep winter cold. He was energized by purpose, but he knew the story was incomplete. The registry extended to 1942, but the letters he found mainly stopped around 1937. There was a gap, a more dangerous silence, corresponding precisely to the darkening period in Europe. He had avoided the cellar. Basements in neglected houses are repositories of dread dampness and decay. But if Arthur had hidden the most explosive truth, it would be in the most inaccessible place. On the morning of February 4th, 2021, Rob descended the stone steps leading down from the kitchen. The air immediately grew colder, wetter, and heavier. His flashlight beam cut through the thick, musty air, revealing walls streaked with water damage and a floor of uneven, cracked concrete. The cellar was vast, divided into several low-ceilinged rooms, a coal room still black with dust, an old laundry area with enormous zinc tubs, and storage rooms lined with empty shelves. Rob moved slowly, his work boots echoing on the damp floor, searching for any anomaly. In the farthest storage room, away from the boiler and the furnace, he noticed something odd. The concrete floor in a specific section, roughly 3 feet square, looked subtly different from the surrounding floor. He tapped the surface with the heel of his boot. The sound was distinct, a hollow thud, unlike the solid resistance of the rest of the floor. Rob knelt, running his flashlight beam and his gloved hand over the surface. The seam was nearly invisible, masterfully concealed, but unmistakable once he found the edges. He raced back up to the truck and retrieved a heavy crowbar he had brought for prying open stubborn doors. It took 20 minutes of strenuous leverage and prying. The air in the cellar grew thick with his strained breathing and the smell of disturbed, damp earth. Finally, the concrete section grated and popped loose. It was not solid concrete, but a heavy wooden panel thinly capped with concrete and dust, concealing a cavity beneath. Rob's heart hammered against his ribs. This was not the simple charity of the Depression era. This was a secret engineered for permanent concealment. Inside the cavity lay a large metal box, dark green, and military surplus designed to be waterproof. It was heavy, packed tightly with contents. Rob carefully lifted the box out, placing it on the floor with a soft metallic ring, and then used the crowbar to reseal the cavity, leaving no trace. He carried his prize upstairs to the parlor, placing it on the fireplace hearth under the weak light of his work lamp. The lid of the box was sealed with brittle, hardened wax. Rob used a utility knife to chip away the seal and threw the lid open. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, were bundles of papers, but these were different. They were printed on various foreign papers, some in German, some in languages Rob couldn't identify. The dates spanned 1938 to 1941. Rob's hands were shaking as he unwrapped the first bundle. The top document was a typed list of names, dozens of them, each accompanied by a date of arrival and a terse note: arrived from Hamburg via New York, fled Berlin, family of 4 from Vienna. Rob realized with dawning horror and awe that Arthur Maxwell Sr. had not merely sheltered American citizens. He had been involved in the rescue of European refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. He pulled out a letter written in slightly fractured but precise English, dated August 8th, 1939. Dear Mr. Maxwell, I write this as we depart for California. You saved us. My father, a university professor, was dismissed and threatened. My mother was terrified. My sister and I stayed 4 months in your beautiful, quiet home while arrangements were made. The kindness of the other guests teaching us English and sharing their dinners kept my mother's hope alive. We owe you our future. You saved not just our lives, but our faith in humanity. The Levin family. Rob felt tears prick his eyes. This was the missing perilous phase of the sanctuary. As the Great Depression eased slightly, the horror across the ocean had begun. Arthur had shifted his resources, his home, and his immense courage to a far more dangerous form of activism. He found financial ledgers detailing substantial sums spent not on coal or groceries, but on ship passages, train tickets, and legal fees for immigration paperwork. Arthur had spent a fortune to extract people and then relocate them across the vastness of America. He was not a bystander. He was a vital link in an underground network. Rob searched the box again, feeling deeper into the documents. His fingers brushed against something soft and textile. He pulled it out, a small white handkerchief, its edges slightly frayed, embroidered delicately in the corner with the initials RA and a tiny crooked flower. It was a small, desperate token of gratitude, perhaps sewn by a young child sheltered here before embarking on a terrifying journey to a new life. This small piece of fabric, stained by time, held more emotional weight than all the deeds and ledgers combined. He returned to the documents and found what Arthur had buried deepest, the reason for the final abrupt closure. It was a telegram dated November 18th, 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor. Stop immediately, stop government inquiries, stop association with refugees considered suspicious, stop risk to your safety, stop close operation. Arthur had been under investigation. In the tense climate of pre-war America, helping refugees, especially intellectuals, artists, and those considered potentially subversive, was viewed with deep suspicion. The FBI or some other agency had been watching. Attached was a final handwritten note from Arthur. I will complete arrangements for those currently here, but I must close the house. The risk has grown too great not for myself, but for those I help. If I am arrested, it would bring attention that would endanger the entire network. I will seal the records and hope that someday when the world has changed, someone will understand what we tried to do. The journal entries ended there. The sanctuary closed its doors sometime in 1942, and Arthur carried that terrifying secret alone for the rest of his very long life. Rob sat back, his mind reeling. The scope of Arthur's courage was overwhelming. He hadn't just given money. He had risked his freedom and his reputation to save lives from one of history's greatest horrors, and his own family had buried it. He understood the hatred of Uncle George now on a deeper level. This wasn't just about money. It was about fear. In the 1940s and 1950s, during the Red Scare and the height of the Cold War, a history of harboring radical union organizers and suspicious European refugees could have destroyed the family business and ruined every Maxwell's career. They had chosen to sacrifice the truth and Arthur's honor for self-preservation. Rob looked down at the handkerchief and the lists of names saved. Arthur had trusted him, a stranger separated by decades of silence, with this dangerous, magnificent truth. Rob now knew his purpose was far greater than personal reconciliation. It was historical. He had to honor the courage of the dead and overcome the fear of the living. He carefully began photographing every single document, determined to create a secure digital archive. He would contact the university historian immediately. The time for silence was over. Following the intense discoveries in the cellar, Rob acted decisively. He spent another day at Hollowbrook, meticulously organizing and photographing the documents from the metal box, the refugee lists, the financial expenditures for relocation, and the chilling 1941 telegram. He was no longer working alone in the dark. He had a mandate from the past. He drove back to his apartment, the heavy box secured in his truck, and immediately placed a call to Dr. Harrison Whitmore, a historian at a state university whom he had found through a local historical society. Dr. Whitmore specialized in Depression-era social movements, was initially skeptical, but quickly became electrified by Rob's measured account and the digital copies of the guest registry. By the second week of February 2021, Dr. Whitmore had visited Hollowbrook, confirming the historical significance of Rob's findings. He helped Rob draft a press release for the local county paper. Rob knew he had to move fast, creating a public record that his relatives could not easily suppress. The story hit the paper on a rainy Thursday morning. The headline, stark against the gray skies, read, "Hidden History, Local Mansion, Served as Secret Sanctuary for Depression Families and War Refugees." Rob's phone began to ring before 8 a.m. The first calls were from reporters thrilled by the human interest angle, but the second call around 10 was from a number he immediately recognized. "Robert, you self-righteous idiot!" Uncle George's voice was a ragged roar, vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury. "What in heaven's name do you think you're doing, dragging the Maxwell name through the mud with these lunatic conspiracy theories?" Rob gripped the phone, his voice steady. "They aren't theories, George. They are documented facts. Your father and the family buried the truth out of fear. Fear. We were protecting the reputation built over 3 generations. That old man nearly destroyed us with his charity and his radical friends. You had no right to dig this up. You stop this now. I'm calling Phillipson. I'm filing a lawsuit. We will prove that what was invalid, and we will burn every scrap of paper in that house." "You can try, George," Rob replied, the newfound resolve in his voice surprising even himself. "But I have digital archives stored in multiple locations, and the university has copies. The truth is public now. You can't bury it again." George sputtered a final string of threats before the line went dead. Rob knew the legal fight was coming, but he felt strangely calm. The fear that had paralyzed his family for 80 years held no power over him. The third call came an hour later from an unknown New York number. Rob hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Maxwell." The voice on the other end was clear, strong, and unmistakably elderly. "My name is Ruth Adler. I read the article online this morning. I believe your great-grandfather saved my family's life." Rob sat down abruptly. "Ms. Adler, please tell me." Ruth Adler was 91 years old. Her voice, though old, carried the strength of a survivor. "My parents, my older sister, and I arrived in New York in October of 1938. We were refugees from Vienna. My father was a professor, and things had become impossible. We were destitute. Someone in the community told us about a network, and we were sent to your great-grandfather's estate." Rob pulled out the guest registry, scanning the 1938 entries. Levin family. Professor. Vienna. "We stayed 4 months," Ruth continued. "We had rooms on the second floor. My sister and I shared a room with yellow wallpaper. I still remember that yellow wallpaper. The older guests, the artists and writers, taught us English. We had nothing, absolutely nothing. On Christmas Eve that year, your great-grandfather, Mr. Maxwell, brought my sister and me small presents. Simple things, but to us they meant everything. We were Jewish, but he gave us that moment of kindness. He was not just a benefactor, he was a sanctuary." Rob's throat tightened. The sheer weight of that single Christmas gift given in a cold house during a time of global terror was overwhelming. "Did your family survive the war?" "Yes, Mr. Maxwell. Because of him. My father found a position in Ohio. We resettled, and my sister became a doctor, and I became a teacher. We both married, had children. I have 5 grandchildren now. 5 grandchildren who exist because your great-grandfather helped us when no one else would." They talked for 20 minutes. Ruth Adler promised to send old family documents, including a picture she drew of the mansion as a child, to help Rob establish his museum. Rob hung up his eyes, wet with tears. The abstract history had found a living, breathing voice. The R.A. initials on the handkerchief he found in the cellar must have stood for Ruth Adler. That evening, Rob was checking his email when his apartment door buzzer rang. He opened the peephole to see his daughter Julia. She looked stressed, her face pale beneath her makeup. "Dad, I saw the article, and Uncle George is threatening the end of the world. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Julia. Please come in." They sat in his small, quiet living room, the opposite of the grand estate they had last shared. "I don't understand," Julia started, her voice tight. "The whole family thinks you've lost your mind. They say you're chasing ghosts to justify the inheritance. They say it's foolish." "And what do you think?" Rob asked gently. Julia looked away. "I think you've always been practical, Dad. This doesn't seem like you. Why are you risking everything for a man you barely knew?" Rob did not argue. He walked to his desk and returned with the metal box. He carefully opened it and took out one item, the small embroidered handkerchief he had found in the cellar. "Look at this, Julia." He placed the fragile cloth in her hands. This was sewn by a little girl named Ruth Adler decades ago. She and her sister shared a room with yellow wallpaper at Hollowbrook. Her father was a university professor fleeing Austria in 1938. Her family had nothing left. They were waiting to see if they would survive. Rob then told Julia the story of Ruth Adler, recounting the details of the sanctuary, the risk Arthur took, the telegram, and the promise of the Christmas presents. He spoke of George's fear versus Arthur's principle. "This little piece of thread," Rob concluded, pointing to the handkerchief, "is a receipt for a future that produced doctors and teachers and 5 grandchildren who wouldn't exist otherwise. Your great-grandfather Arthur didn't just save them from the Nazis, Julia. He saved their faith in humanity, and he buried the evidence only because his own son was afraid of the truth." Julia sat motionless, turning the tiny handkerchief over and over in her hands. Her professional guarded composure slowly melted away. Rob watched as the reality of the small personal sacrifice, the secret kindness behind the crumbling stone, hit her. She was silent for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes. "The yellow wallpaper," she whispered, her voice catching. "He remembered the yellow wallpaper. He paid attention." She looked up at Rob, her face stripped bare of judgment. "I was wrong, Dad. I thought you were just being stubborn, chasing relevance. I didn't know the legacy was this." Julia stood up and handed the handkerchief back to him. "Uncle George is serious about the lawsuit. He wants to petition the court to have a fiduciary appointed seize the assets and demolish the house. We need a legal strategy." She wasn't just apologizing, she was committing. The emotional barrier between them, built on years of distance and misunderstanding, had finally shattered. "I need your help, Julia," Rob said, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that was far deeper than the fire at George's mansion. "Good," Julia replied, reaching for her phone. Her professional energy returning, but this time directed toward a common cause. "Then let's find a lawyer who knows how to fight for history. We start by drafting a response to Phillipson's office, first thing tomorrow, February 17th, 2021. Rob knew the battle ahead would be bitter and long fought in courtrooms and headlines. But he was no longer alone. He had the truth of Arthur Maxwell Sr., and for the first time in years, he had his daughter standing beside him. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings, historical documentation, and media interviews. With Julia's organizational skills and access to sharp legal counsel, Rob established the Arthur Maxwell Sanctuary Foundation as the official entity designated to receive the Hollowbrook estate. This preemptive legal maneuver aimed to fulfill Arthur Sr.'s wishes, using the property for humanitarian and educational purposes, making it nearly impossible for Uncle George to liquidate or destroy it. The family war was waged primarily through angry voicemails and terse letters from George's lawyers, but the climax arrived on a cold Saturday morning in early March 2021. Rob was at Hollowbrook with Dr. Whitmore and a small team of students carefully packaging the delicate yellow documents for professional archival. They had just uncovered a box of old sheet music left by a composer who found refuge in 1935. A black late-model SUV roared up the gravel drive and skidded to a stop near Rob's truck. Uncle George, looking furious and impeccably dressed despite the mud, stepped out, followed by his lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a man known for his cold efficiency. "Robert, stop this farce immediately!" George's voice was strained, high-pitched with outrage. "This is trespassing. My counsel is filing an injunction this afternoon to freeze all activity. We will not allow you to turn my grandfather's home into a communist museum." Rob set down the brittle sheet music and walked calmly toward his uncle. Julia had taught him that calmness was his strongest weapon against George's bluster. "This property belongs to the Arthur Maxwell Sanctuary Foundation now, George. As the sole heir and founder, I am overseeing the archival process. You have no legal standing here." "The will is invalid," George spat, taking a step closer. "You preyed on a dying, senile man. We will have the estate reverted, and when we do, I swear, I will bulldoze the house and salt the earth to prevent this filth from ever surfacing again." Rob looked past George to the old mansion, imagining the history, the desperate families, the fleeing intellectuals, the small, profound acts of kindness reduced to rubble. He thought of Ruth Adler's yellow wallpaper and the tiny embroidered handkerchief. "You can't erase this, George," Rob said firmly. "You had 80 years to destroy the evidence, and you failed. I've already donated digital copies of the registry, the journal, and the refugee lists to the university and to the County Historical Society. The truth is published. You can destroy the stone, but you cannot destroy the history." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on his uncle. "Your father and grandfather chose to bury Arthur Sr.'s courage out of fear of what society might think. I choose to honor it. You may file all the injunctions you want, but this is the legacy Arthur intended to endure. It's too late for shame to win." George's face went slack, defeated not by law, but by finality. His lawyer tugged his arm, whispering urgently about libel and the ongoing legal battle. George glared at Rob one last time, his eyes burning with impotent rage, before turning and retreating into his SUV. Rob watched them drive away, then turned back to the quiet, determined students. The legal battle would drag on for over a year, but the foundation held its ground, supported by historical evidence and growing public interest. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday in mid-September 2022, the Hollowbrook estate looked transformed. The legal wrangling had finally ceased after a favorable court ruling upheld the will's intent, validating the foundation. Initial stabilization work had been completed, the roof repaired, broken windows replaced, and the 43 acres cleared of the most aggressive overgrowth. A banner simple and dignified hung over the freshly painted porch, Arthur Maxwell Sanctuary Historical Site and Educational Center. This was the day of the grand opening. Rob, dressed in a sharp, unfamiliar suit, stood near the entrance, greeting the small but steady stream of visitors. He wasn't just the estranged heir. He was the executive director of the foundation. The first 3 rooms had been converted into modest exhibition halls. The guest registry lay open in a climate-controlled case. Enlarged photographs of the refugees, faces of artists and families from the 1930s and 1940s, lined the walls. The embroidered handkerchief was displayed under glass, a powerful, silent monument to gratitude. Rob felt a lump in his throat as he watched Ruth Adler, now 93, arrive, supported by her daughter. She gazed up at the mansion, her eyes bright with tears. "It looks just as beautiful as I remember," she whispered to Rob, clutching his hand, "except happier now. It is no longer just a house of fear." Other descendants followed a man whose painter grandfather had found his voice here, a composer's great-granddaughter. The history was no longer dusty documents, it was flesh and blood. Then Rob's gaze caught a car turning into the drive, a familiar silver sedan. Julia stepped out looking proud, sharp, and entirely comfortable. By her side was his granddaughter Clara, now 16, who had spent the last summer volunteering to catalog the books in the study. Behind them, pulling up slowly, was another car he recognized. Ethan. Rob's son, Ethan, had called 3 months ago. The conversation had been halting and difficult, at first filled with unspoken regrets, but the barrier had finally broken when Ethan admitted he had read all the articles and was deeply moved by the story of great-grandfather Arthur. He flew in from California with his wife and 2 young children. Julia walked over, giving her father a proud hug. "You look exhausted, Dad, but good. Ethan's nervous." "Me too," Rob admitted. He looked past his daughter and saw his 2 young grandchildren wide-eyed, running toward the porch, pulled by the energy of the event. Soon it was time for the dedication speech. Rob stood on the newly stabilized front steps, looking out over the crowd. His eyes found Julia standing proudly with Clara and Ethan holding his youngest child, watching him. 6 months ago, Rob began, his voice slightly shaking. I stood here and saw a ruin. I saw a financial burden and a source of deep, abiding family hatred. I saw a reminder of everything I had lost. He paused, collecting his resolve. But what I inherited was not property. It was a moral principle. My great-grandfather, Arthur Maxwell Sr., was a man who chose principle over profit, compassion over reputation. He spent his fortune and risked his freedom to run this sanctuary, helping people when the world and his own family told him to look away. He spoke of the terror in Europe, the hardship of the Depression, and the quiet dignity of the people Arthur saved. He spoke of the fear that drove his own family to bury the truth for decades. Arthur Maxwell Sr. was eventually isolated because he chose to do what was right. But he left a message sealed in a metal box in a hidden photograph, hoping that one day someone would choose to finish his work. Rob looked directly at his children. The WWII. The work of the Arthur Maxwell Sanctuary Foundation is not just to preserve history. It is to remind us that courage is a choice, and that when we stand up for those in need, we honor the best part of our humanity. This house is a testament that the small, silent choices we make endure longer than any fortune. The applause was sustained and warm. Ruth Adler was weeping quietly. Afterward, Ethan approached his children, clinging to his legs. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry it took me this long to see what was important. I'm proud of you, Dad." Rob pulled his son into a hug, the first real hug in years. He held his grandchildren close. The isolation that had defined his life since 2020 was finally completely gone. Rob stood near the bronze plaque dedicated to the sanctuary, watching his children and grandchildren move through the halls. He had inherited the house on Christmas night, December 25th, 2020, an act that threatened to destroy him. But by honoring the legacy of the man who saw him, he had finally found his own purpose, and in doing so, he had restored the broken heart of his family. He had won more than an inheritance. He had won back his life. And so the legacy of Arthur Maxwell Sr. reminds us that true family wealth is not measured in acres or in dollars, but in the courage to uphold our principles when the world demands silence. Robert learned that the greatest battle is often fought not against enemies, but against the fear that prevents us from honoring the truth. This is a powerful lesson in choosing compassion over conformity. If this touching tale of sacrifice and restoration resonated with your own heart, please show your support for telling more stories like this by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with someone you cherish. And right now, click the video appearing on your screen to join us for our newest discovery of human kindness.